What if I told you that Nazi Germany's downfall began not in the rubble of Berlin, but on a bright summer morning in 1941, when Hitler made a gamble so reckless that it sealed his empire's fate before it even reached its peak? This is the story of Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery, stormed into the Soviet Union for a brief moment. It looked like the Nazis might actually succeed. Cities fell in days, armies were encircled, and the world held its breath. But lurking beneath the thunder of blitzkrieg was a flaw so deep, so devastating, that it would transform triumph into disaster. To understand why this single campaign doomed Hitler's regime, we need to rewind the clock. By 1940, Hitler seemed unstoppable. Poland crushed, France humiliated, Britain barely hanging on. His armies had rewritten the rules of modern warfare, with blitzkrieg fast-moving, armored spearheads supported by air power. Germany's enemies were falling like dominoes. So why not strike the Soviet Union, the largest nation on Earth? On paper, it made no sense. The USSR was vast, cold, and full of resources Germany desperately needed, but also full of people ready to defend it. Yet Hitler believed it would be quick, decisive, and easy. He was convinced that Soviet communism was a rotten structure that would collapse with one hard push. His generals hesitated, but he silenced them. He wanted Lebensraum, living space in the East. He wanted oil, grain, and industry. And above all, he wanted to crush Bolshevism, the ideological enemy he had ranted about since Mein Kampf. What Hitler didn't realize was that by attacking the Soviet Union, he was awakening a giant with deeper reserves of manpower, industry, and determination than Germany could ever match. His gamble wasn't just bold, it was suicidal. And the road to Stalingrad, Moscow, and Kursk all begins here. By the summer of 1940, Adolf Hitler stood at the peak of his power. His armies had crushed France in just 6 weeks, a nation many thought invincible. Denmark and Norway had fallen. Poland was already erased from the map. Only Britain still stood, bruised but defiant, across the Channel. To the outside world, Nazi Germany looked unstoppable. But inside Hitler's mind, the real war had not yet begun. Since the 1920s, Hitler had been obsessed with the idea of Lebensraum, living space for the German people. To him, Germany's destiny lay not in the West, but in the vast, fertile lands of the East, Ukraine's wheat fields, the oil-rich Caucasus, the mineral wealth of Siberia. These resources would fuel his empire for 1,000 years. And to seize them, he would need to destroy the Soviet Union. But this wasn't just about territory. For Hitler, it was ideological. He saw communism as a cancer, a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, and the Soviet Union as its heart. His speeches and writings were littered with visions of a racial war of annihilation. He told his generals that defeating Stalin would be like kicking in the door of a rotten house once. It collapsed. The rest of the structure would crumble. There was also a sense of urgency. Hitler knew that Britain, stubborn as ever, was hoping the Soviet Union or the United States might eventually join the war. He believed that by crushing the USSR quickly, he could force Britain to accept peace on his terms. In his mind, destroying Stalin was the key to securing German domination of Europe. And there was another factor: overconfidence. Blitzkrieg had given Hitler a sense of invincibility. He had defied his generals before, and each time his gamble had paid off. Against France, they warned him it was too risky as Paris had fallen. Against Norway, they feared disaster. Yet, it was a success. Why should Russia be any different? So, in December 1940, Hitler signed Directive No. 21, the plan for Operation Barbarossa. 3 massive army groups would drive deep into Soviet territory, north toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, and south toward Ukraine. He believed the campaign would last just a few months. By autumn, he boasted, the Soviet Union would be destroyed. What Hitler failed to grasp was the sheer scale of what he was taking on. Distances in the Soviet Union weren't measured in miles, but in entire lifetimes. Its armies were battered, but not broken. Its factories ready to move east of the Urals. Its people hardened by decades of struggle. Hitler thought he was launching a lightning war. In reality, he was stepping into a swamp that would swallow his empire whole. On June 22, 1941, the eastern horizon lit up with fire. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the largest invasion force in human history crossed into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was underway. Nearly 3.3 million German soldiers, supported by over 600,000 vehicles and 3,500 tanks, surged across an 1,800-mile front. Alongside them were hundreds of thousands of Romanian, Hungarian, and Finnish troops. It wasn't just an attack, it was an earthquake. The opening blows were devastating. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, caught much of the Soviet air force on the ground, destroying nearly 4,000 aircraft in the first days. The Red Army's frontline divisions, unprepared and poorly positioned, were smashed by fast-moving panzers that cut through defenses like a knife through paper. Entire Soviet armies, sometimes hundreds of thousands of men, were encircled and captured in vast cauldrons. From Minsk to Smolensk, German soldiers advanced so quickly that their commanders could hardly keep up. In the first weeks, the Wehrmacht pushed hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Roads clogged with retreating civilians, fleeing soldiers, and abandoned equipment painted a picture of total collapse. To many observers, it seemed Hitler's boasts of a rotten structure had been right. The numbers were staggering. By September, German forces had inflicted millions of casualties. Soviet commanders were reeling, desperately trying to reform shattered units and slow the tide. Cities like Riga, Vilnius, and Smolensk fell with shocking speed. Hitler and his generals began to believe they were witnessing the rapid collapse of the Soviet state, and in truth, there were moments when it looked like the Red Army might not recover. Stalin himself was shaken, retreating into silence for days after the invasion began. Moscow trembled. Some Soviet citizens even greeted the Germans as liberators at first, hoping for relief from Stalin's brutal rule, but beneath the surface, something was stirring. The Soviet Union was bleeding, yes, but it was not broken. The sheer size of the country gave it depth. Factories began evacuating east, beyond the reach of German bombers. Millions of civilians were mobilized to build defenses, dig trenches, and form partisan units. Stalin, after his initial shock, returned to lead with a grim determination, not a step back. For now, though, the Germans seemed unstoppable. Their tanks thundered forward, their armies marched deeper into Russia, and Hitler began to believe he was on the brink of his greatest victory. Yet with every mile gained, the noose began to tighten not around the Soviets, but around Germany itself. At first glance, Operation Barbarossa seemed like another stunning triumph for the Wehrmacht. But as the German columns pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the cracks began to show. Blitzkrieg had always depended on speed, surprise, and short campaigns. Yet the Soviet Union was too vast, too rugged, and too unyielding for that formula to work. The first problem was logistics. Germany's supply system simply couldn't keep up with the rapid advance. The Soviet Union's roads were primitive, often just dirt tracks that turned into oceans of mud during rain. Railways were built on a different gauge than Europe's, meaning captured lines were useless until painstakingly converted. Fuel shortages became chronic. German tanks that had raced ahead often sat idle, waiting for gasoline that never came. Then came the distances. The further the Wehrmacht drove east, the more stretched their lines became. Trucks and horses hauled supplies across hundreds of miles, vulnerable to breakdowns, ambushes, and exhaustion. Soldiers went hungry, ammunition ran low, and uniforms began to wear out faster than they could be replaced. What was supposed to be a quick campaign was dragging into something far heavier. And then there was the land itself. The endless forests, rivers, and swamps swallowed men and machines alike. Summer heat baked the soldiers during the day, while nights chilled them to the bone. Dust-clogged engines, water-spoiled food, and disease spread in the ranks. The Soviets, meanwhile, were fighting with a brutal stubbornness. Every village was fortified, every river contested, every retreat turned into another ambush. German commanders began to notice the change. Victories were still coming, but they were harder won, bloodier and slower. Instead of shattering, the Red Army was regrouping. Instead of collapsing, the Soviet state was adapting. Hitler had promised a lightning war, but by late summer of 1941, his army was already running out of lightning. The Wehrmacht was still marching toward Moscow, but the illusion of invincibility was beginning to fade. Winter was coming, and with it, a nightmare that Germany was utterly unprepared to face. By the autumn of 1941, all eyes turned toward Moscow. For Hitler, the Soviet capital wasn't just a city, it was the symbol of Stalin's regime. He believed that if Moscow fell, the Soviet Union would collapse, just as France had after Paris. Army Group Center, the strongest German force, was ordered to drive straight for the heart of the Soviet Union. At first, it seemed possible. Operation Typhoon, launched in October, opened with devastating insurrection. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were trapped and captured near Vyazma and Bryansk. German troops,